Back and forth in my cell there in those early days, taking 3 steps in turn, 3 steps in turn, and I've developed quite an empathy for lions and tigers that I see in the zoo pacing back and forth in their cage. Walking several miles a day at that rate, I would dwell upon the fact that when I returned, and although sometimes it was difficult, I never thought that I wouldn't, when I returned there would be opportunities just like this. Opportunities to share that experience, the things that I had learned, how I'd survived. And I would ask myself at that time, what are you going to say? How can you keep from blowing this opportunity, which may last 20 or 30 minutes at the most? What are you going to share? And the entire time I was in prison, I didn't know what the answer to that question was. And I didn't know until I returned home in February of 1973. And when I returned, I found a very different country, a different America, a different society, a different world in so many ways. And if you'll project yourselves back to that period between 1966 and 73 and think about your own changes in your family, your community, the changes that you saw in our nation. We were still suffering from the trauma of Vietnam, and it was to get worse when South Vietnam fell. It was almost as if we could foresee the problems of Watergate coming upon us. Our society had become so complex. And it finally occurred to me that the same key to my survival there in prison during those years would serve me well on a daily basis at home in America. And the key to that survival was faith. Faith. Not just spiritual faith, that of course, but first of all, faith in myself as an individual to hack it, to gut it out, to last as long as I was going to have to. Faith in the men around me, my fellow man, if you will, and the fellow Americans, the Vietnamese, my fellow Americans and family at home. Faith in my country, America, the principles upon which it's founded, which have made it endure, and faith in God, in my God. And I'd like to share with you how those aspects of faith served me so well in prison and do on a continuing basis right here at home. First of all, faith in ourselves as individuals. Faith in ourselves to adjust and to accept that new situation. Faith in ourselves to resist the exploitation, the efforts of the enemy to extract military information and propaganda through writing letters or making tapes or encouraging other prisoners newly shot down to cooperate with the prison authorities. Faith in ourselves to minimize the net gain that the enemy could receive by having us at his total mercy. Keeping faith in ourselves to stay fit physically by walking those several miles a day, keeping our muscle tone up, doing push-ups, sit-ups, deep breathing exercises, you name it, anything to maintain the muscle tone, to be ready to face whatever might come around the corner the next day, whether it be a forced march to China or more torture. Keeping faith in ourselves to stay alive mentally, not letting our minds and brains atrophy. And we developed several means of doing this. Memory work was one of the primary ways of staying busy and active mentally. We memorized the books of the Bible and the capitals of the states all alphabetically. There was one time when I had memorized over 450 names of other American prisoners that I'd received through our communication system there. And I would go over them every other day or so, all alphabetically, and I had 27 A's or 35 B's and 42 C's, and maybe I'd only come up with 41 C's that one day, go back over my C's to make sure I didn't drop that one. Because if I should have an opportunity to escape or be released for whatever reason, I could share with our government and the families of those men who the prisoners were, because the North Vietnamese certainly weren't putting out the word. Memorizing all of the old French, German, Spanish vocabulary words that we could extract from our high school and college language days, and passing those and grammar rules through the walls. And when I returned and went to Berkeley for 2 years, pursuing a master's in political science, I achieved 2 years of college credit by exam for the French that I learned through the walls of Hanoi. One of my Air Force contemporaries there was a real godsend. He knew poetry. It seemed that when he was a youngster, his mother used to force him to learn a brand new poem to recite to the annual Thanksgiving family reunion every year, and he hated it. But she made him do it. I guess he wouldn't get any turkey for dinner or something, but he always did. But more amazingly, he retained so much of that poetry, and he began passing it through the walls to us. Classics such as Shakespeare's sonnets and the poems of Rudyard Kipling, Ballad of East and West, the poem If, Gunga Din. We memorized Alfred Noyes' The Highwayman, and when I was released, I had memorized, committed to memory, about 35 or 40 poems, some of them very long and epic, with dozens of stanzas. And we particularly appreciated the poems by Kipling, particularly for their masculine appeal, I think. It was interesting that a stanza from Kipling, poem If, was quoted yesterday. And I'd like to quote another one that meant so much to us. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve their term long after they are gone, when there's nothing left within you except the will that says to them, hold on, hold on. Well, as we began to develop this appreciation for poetry, we all tried our hand at composing poetry. And I say compose rather than wrote because we had no pencil and paper, and if you wanted to compose a poem, you just made it up line for line and memorized the lines and then the verses and so on. And I'll never forget my own first attempt at composing poetry. Sometimes to break up our usual rice diet, we had bread, and it would come in a little crust, kind of like a small French loaf. But you can be sure that wherever the flour for that bread was kept in those dungeon-like prisons of Wallow, there were bugs and weevils and lice and roaches and so on, so at least we had a little protein supplement in our bread when we got it. But I was sitting on my concrete slab one day, and I took a bite out of my bread and I composed my first poem. I said, "Little weevil in my bread, I think I just bit off your head." Of course I had, and that poem went downhill after that. It didn't get any better. But as I was sitting there in the sweltering heat of a Hanoi summer, my body covered with heat rash, not knowing whether, when, or if I'd ever go home, I found myself laughing, and I thought, God, you must be going off your rocker, you know. But I wasn't. I was maintaining that sense of humor, that axiomatic sense of humor that is known to be found in American fighting men. And that was brought forth again later on in a part of Wallow prison that we had named Heartbreak Hotel. And it was called Heartbreak Hotel because it was where you were usually taken after your initial interrogations, whether they lasted 2 weeks or 4 weeks or a month and a half. Heartbreak Hotel consisted of a small cell block of 8 cells, 4 rows on either side of a center passageway. And old cell number 8 had been converted into a shower. By that I mean a rusty pipe just ran up the wall and bent over at the top so the water could run on your head. Inevitably, every man would be taken to cell number 8 so he could bathe, and the guard would shove him in very brusquely and slam the door and say, "Wash." And you'd be left alone. And you'd reflect back over those previous weeks and feel about as low as the vermin that was scurrying across the decks of old cell number 8 there, because inevitably you were disappointed in yourself. No matter how you'd done, you hadn't been as tough as you thought you would be. And it was hard to accept. Well, you'd strip off the tattered remnants of your flight suit if you had that left, or maybe the ill-fitting shirt or shorts that some peasant might have loaned you on the way to Hanoi. Turn on the cold water of that shower and stand there and hang onto the pipe and let it run over your head. And pretty soon you'd look up, and there, at eye level, scratched indelibly by some American before you, were the words, "Smile, you're on candid camera." And you would, of course, and it made all the difference in the world, and you could turn yourself around. Keeping faith in that sense of humor, keeping faith in your ability to maintain your priorities and your sanity and your sense of values in an Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll world where people don't even use the same dictionary. Keeping faith in yourself to obey that American fighting man's code of conduct, those 6 articles which prescribe the behavior that is expected of us in those circumstances. Keeping faith in ourselves to minimize the net gain to the enemy. Faith in ourselves to be tough, to last, to endure for as long as necessary. Well, when I returned to America there in February of